You are listening to the Examine Life with Bram Levinson. So, this is an interesting one. This episode, I think, is an interesting one because I think it speaks to every one of us. No matter who you are, no matter where you're from, no matter what your situation is, I think that this speaks to every single one of us. I have always been an emotional person, and I have always veered by default towards emotion than I did towards logic. So as a kid, I was very emotional. I was very empathetic as well. And as an empath, if I was in the presence of someone who was angry or who was stressed or who was emanating what I then thought was just dark energy, I would absorb it quickly. And it would make me so uncomfortable. I'd have to remove myself from the situation, or my behavior would start to become a little bit erratic because I just didn't know how to embody that energy and to be with it, you know. And actually, my parents saw therapists, this couple, for years and years and years when my brothers and I were children. And the therapist told them that I was the barometer of the family, that if anything was going on in the family that was out of the ordinary, it would most likely manifest through me, in my behavior, in whatever emotion I expressed. And that was true. You know, I was the one who would be moved to tears if something was going on. I was the one who, I think was more susceptible to things like anxiety and depression. And I think I experienced them on a level that I wouldn't wish on anybody as a kid. But nonetheless, I have had a charmed life. I don't want to make it sound like, my suffering was debilitating. I mean, in moments it felt like it was, but nonetheless, I recognize that I've had a charmed life. I recognize specifically with my family that we as a family have led a charmed life, that, we haven't really suffered as a family. About 8 or 9 years ago, my mom had to go through cancer treatment because she did a routine mammogram and they found a protein in her breast that was precancerous, a protein that she was genetically predisposed to producing. And so, in order to stop that production of the protein, in order to get the protein out of her system, she had to go through cancer treatment. And I remember when she let us know that this is what was happening. And trust me, my parents do not lay heavy shit on us, their children, unless there's no choice. So when my mother started to tell me what was going on, I knew that she had already been going through this for X amount of weeks, maybe even months, before she was telling me, because my parents are very clear about what the role of the parent is and what the role of the child is. And while that can be incredibly helpful as a child to not have to deal with more shit than you have to deal with, it also meant that we weren't there to support my mother when my mother possibly needed support in the early, stages of figuring out what was going on. Anyway, I digress. When my mother told me what was going on, the first thought that came to mind was, we've been really, really, really fortunate. We have made it this far. I don't know, I was 36, 30, 35, 36, 37, something like that. And I was just so aware that this was the first time that we had to come together as a family and get through something as a family. And, we did. We came together, we focused, and, everyone is here, happy, healthy, telling the tale. But nonetheless, I have always been an emotional person. And so when this first landed, when my mom first told me about this, my first emotion was fear. Because whenever that word cancer gets brought into the equation, and my mother didn't have cancer, right? But it was a precancerous protein that she was producing naturally. So the second the word cancer came into the equation, there was fear. And of course, me as the emotional one, I would always jump to worst case scenario. My mother is going to pass away. This is going to kill her. I'm going to lose my mother. We're going to lose our mother. And then very quickly, another part of me kicked in and said, look, that you don't know that. That's absolutely not true. There is no cancer. There's just this thing. She's got to do this to get rid of this thing. Support her while she goes through this. And it may not be, fun, and it may get messy, but that's what we're here to do. We are here to almost huddle around her and support her and support my father and support each other and get through it. Live through it. Life is happening. What are you going to do? So when all that downloaded for me, that's exactly what we did. We dealt with it methodically. We dealt with it step by step, day by day, stage by stage, and we got through it. I want to say a couple of years ago anyway, my partner was diagnosed with a form of skin cancer. And that got a lot scarier because it was closer to home, because it was at home. It was in my home. And there was a doctor who was incredibly irresponsible with how he conveyed the information. And he did it in a way that left my partner and I thinking that, death was a very possible option, that it could be likely. And that was not the case. But nonetheless, because that was how the information was conveyed, there was so much fear. There was so much fear in both of our equations, individually and collectively. And my thought was, worst case scenario, he's going to die. He's going to die, and holy shit, this is coming out of nowhere. What do I do? And immediately, I kicked into go mode. Immediately, I started to contact doctors, speak to receptionists, book appointments. I went into the most productive mode that I could, and it was really by default. And I've learned that when shit goes down, when chaos gets a little bit intense, my default, I think I'm hardwired this way, my default is to start to get whatever needs to get done, so that we can move through the process efficiently. I'm not into running away from a situation. I never have been. I like to deal with something. Well, I'm not sure if I like to deal with it, but I do. I'm hardwired to deal with the situation and to start dealing with it as soon as possible so that we can move through it and experience it and have it be done. I guess I'm pretty efficient that way, but it really isn't a voluntary thing. It's something that just starts happening. And so when this happened at home, I just started to, yes, there was serious emotion and serious fear, but there was also do all of these things in order to assuage that fear, in order to, diminish it a little bit, however much possible. And ultimately that fear with my mother and with my partner was, and I guess anytime it's medical, that fear is always, diminished, helped out. Well, I shouldn't say helped out, but that fear is diminished by getting information, right? I'm not a medical person. We have to rely on the medical community in order to show us what the options are, in order to give us more information, that kind of thing. And so I was hell-bent on getting in touch with these, with the medical community, with the medical experts, in order to be able to bit by bit chip away at that fear until I could regulate my blood pressure, that kind of thing, until I could learn how to breathe deeply again. And listen, I teach yoga, I teach meditation, I study yoga, I study meditation, I study breathing, and I know that there are moments in time where fear is going to be so prevalent that it's going to steal your ability to actually take a deep breath. Now, I'm somebody who has trained myself to take a deep breath the moment I recognize threat or fear. And there were moments where, I thought, okay, hang on a second, stop, take a deep breath, and then proceed with, response instead of reaction. And I remember standing there thinking, I can't breathe. I can't inhale up into my thoracic cavity. I can't breathe up into my lungs, into my rib cage. It was a moment of information for me, and it was, I think, was it happening this way because it was meant to teach me something, or was I just choosing to learn something from it? Debatable. But in those moments, the lesson that I took was that I needed to be able to remember what it felt like to not take a deep breath in order to relate to the people who I accompany, who I coach, who I mentor, who I teach, who I spend time with, who are going through darkness, who are going through shadow, who are accompanied by a moment that they'd rather not be accompanied by, so that I can relate to their inability to take a deep breath. That's the lesson I took from it. But nonetheless, I dealt with this whole situation as well as I could, and got appointments made and sort of illuminated the path forward. And that's what it really was for me, was the ability to understand that I needed to be able to identify what the next steps were when no one was giving us the next steps. And that's where this doctor, who initially I think really fucked up, because I suppose we can't expect our medical experts to go above and beyond what they're supposed to do, but it would be nice. It would be nice when you give somebody really shitty news to tell them what the next step is, instead of, not doing that and hanging up the phone and giving that information over the phone. But anyway, again, I digress. So I'm telling you all this because in my life, I have spent quite a bit of time jumping between what in psychological terms is referred to or are referred to as the emotional mind and the reasoning mind. Now, the reasoning mind is often referred to as the rational mind. And I used to refer to it as the rational mind, but what I don't like about that term is if you refer to the logical mind as the rational mind, then does that make the emotional mind the irrational mind? I don't think so. So I prefer the reasoning or logical mind. I have spent an inordinate amount of time dancing between the two, as I think we all have. And I think that most of us could identify which mind we, by default, operate from. Some of us are more logical in our thinking, especially when something goes wrong or when something extreme occurs. And others are more emotional. I've always considered myself to be somebody who's more emotional, especially when things go wrong. But what's interesting is when I become really emotional, it then brings me to the logical by default. Hardwired, I kick into the logical. I start to methodically take care of things, and that helps me deal with the emotional. Now, there are other examples. There are other stories, and some of them are pretty funny of, me being in my emotional mind. Twice over the past 2 months. So when it's not winter in Montreal, Game of Thrones winter, I get around town on a scooter. I drive a scooter around town, a moped, whatever you want to call it. And I've had it for 10 years, and it's still kicking. It's in great shape. However, the gas gauge doesn't work. And so I'm pretty good with going to the gas station every so often to just, fill up the scooter or to check to see what the gas level is at. Over the past, let's say 2 months, let's say 3 months. Over the past 3 months, there have been 2 instances where I ran out of gas. First time it happened, I was coming from downtown. I had just been teaching a class downtown. I was coming back. I was coming over the mountain. And if you don't know Montreal, there is a mountain in the middle of the city, Mount Royal, Montreal, Montréal. And I was coming from one side of the mountain, going up the mountain, going over the mountain, and then coming down. And as I was coming up the mountain, the first time, I ran out of gas. My scooter died. And I remember thinking, oh, this is the death of the scooter. I didn't think it was the gas. And immediately I kicked into panic mode. I thought, what am I going to do? Who am I going to phone? Are they going to have to come pick me up? What's going to happen? I don't even know what the protocol is here. And immediately, the thoughts, one by one kicked in. And the interesting thing about those thoughts is they were unconscious. I wasn't thinking these things on purpose. And I understand that the mind is basically just a meaning-making machine that interprets constantly, and it does that without effort. We're not trying to interpret our experiences. The mind just does this automatically without any effort on our part. But ultimately, I was, on the scooter just trying to get it started. Sometimes it would kick back in. I guess there was like a little bit of gas left. So I would then, drive another, 200-300 meters, and then it would die again. And at this point, I'm pretty much on the mountain midway and just thinking, what the hell? And trust me, I am sweating. I was sweating in that helmet. I'm not going to go into detail, but I was sweating. And so to make a long story short, I, at one point, had to, straddling my scooter, I was walking the scooter up the mountain, cresting a hill, so that once I got over the hill, I could coast down where there was a red light waiting for me, nonetheless, but without me wanting it to be there, but nonetheless, there was this red light waiting for me, and I, get to the red light. I kind of went through it, I'm not going to lie, and kept going, and managed to get the scooter to a gas station that was near my place, filled it up. At that point, I had realized it was the gas, and, thought, okay, this is not going to happen again. This is not going to happen again. This was horrible. I get home, my whole body is sore, it's tense, and again, sweating. Done. Cut to last week. I'm leaving a friend's place who lives pretty much where I initially lost control of the scooter, where the scooter died months ago. She lives right there. I'm leaving her place. I'm taking the exact same route over the mountain, and lo and behold, my scooter dies again. And I'm thinking, you have got to be shitting me. I cannot believe that I'm running. And immediately I knew what it was because I've now experienced it, right? Once we have the experience, the mind immediately defers back to what it knows. And so, history repeating itself. At least it was nighttime and it was cooler. I am straddling the scooter. I'm walking it up the mountain. Same thing. I coast down. I go through that fucking red light is there again. I go through that red light. And long story short, I get it back to the gas station where I got it the first time. I fill it up and I just think, okay, listen. It's not about freaking out and what's going to happen and how is it. It's about filling your scooter up with gas. It's about thinking methodically. I think that I can spend so much time in the emotional mind that there was a part of me that was thinking, oh, it's not going to happen again. It'll be fine. I know what I'm doing. Life will work itself out. And I don't want to, how can I put this? I don't want to romanticize how I am in the world, but I think that there is a part of me that thinks, oh, you know what, like it happened once, I learned from it, I'll sort it out. There's a lot of, in the wellness community, in the yoga community, in the spiritual community, there's a lot of this romanticism, this romanticizing, this life is going to provide, the universe is going to provide. And what I have learned through experience, through study, and just through hard work is that, no, the universe is not going to provide unless you do your fucking work. Unless you do your share of the work, the universe is not going to do anything. It will meet you once you do your work. And the Hindu scriptures are very specific about this. Doing work is essential. You have got to do the work that comes to you. That's a direct quote from the Bhagavad Gita. But nonetheless, unless you do your work, the shit is not going to take care of itself. We are here in these bodies for a reason, and it is to be able to gain experience. It is through that gaining of experience that the soul evolves, that consciousness evolves. So, I got to that gas station the second time, and I just thought, you know what? This is on me. This is on me. And so you better believe that every couple of days now, I am checking the gas level in my scooter. I went from being super emotional, like, what's this going to be? Fear, to I'm an idiot. I just need to fill it up. I need to go into the logical part of my mind, look for the evidence, right? What is the evidence here? The evidence is I didn't fill my scooter up. So, conclusion, I have no gas. It could not be more elementary. Some of us operate more from the emotional mind. Some of us operate more from the reasoning mind or the logical mind. Emotional-minded people typically, and I don't want to make sweeping generalizations, but the emotional-minded people ultimately feel, and they communicate in the I feel. We start using the emotional mind before we start using the reasoning mind, and this is typically in infancy and childhood. So that would explain why as a kid I was so emotional, long before I was rational. And the emotional mind works without any involvement, without any influence from the reasoning part of the mind. So people who who operate from this part of the mind, again, emotionally speak. They emotionally emote. You see it in them. And ultimately, that emotional proclivity starts to change a little bit when we start to age, when we start to grow up, when we start going to school, when we start meeting other people. And we almost are forced to use the rational or the reasoning. Well, see, I shouldn't say rational. The reasoning, logical part of our mind. Because it requires us to step out of the emotional part of the mind and start to adhere to structure, start to adhere to intellect. When you go to school, you've got to work against, well, that was my experience, but you have to work with, rather, the structure of the school, the structure of whatever institution you're in, that kind of thing. Now, people who operate from the reasoning mind typically are people who aren't so much in the I feel, they're in the I think. And they express themselves this way. Or I just believe. They're very much into the I just believe. People who operate from this part of the mind don't freak out as often as the emotional ones. They tend to be more methodical. They tend to look for evidence. They are evidence-based. So they're going to look for any evidence that either dispels or reaffirms whatever their hypothesis is, and then they're going to operate based on whatever the conclusions are. When I was going through this whole moment with my partner and the skin cancer, I remember saying to myself, there is a lot of fear right now. I was aware of it, and I was in the presence of it. And I remember saying to myself, you have got to remind your heart what your head knows. And what I'm talking about is after this initial doctor had, laid all this information on us and hung up, we then went to our family doctor. And the family doctor had just taken blood work from my partner a couple of days ago and basically said there is nothing in this blood work to indicate that there's anything wrong. So he was giving us evidence. There was still tons and tons and tons of fear in me and in my partner. But all I could really work with at that moment was the fear in me in order to then be able to work with him. And I remember saying to myself, there is evidence that dispels this fear. So you have got to remind your heart what your head knows. People who operate from the heart, emotional. People who operate from the head, logical, intellectual, reasoning. Now, the people who are more reasoning, who operate more from the reasoning mind, in many instances are going to have to remind their head what their heart knows. These are people who don't necessarily move into emotional intelligence as easily as those of us who are operating from the emotional mind. And very often it can be unhelpful to be too logical, to be too reasoning, to be too rigid. The shadow side of living in the rational, I keep saying it, the reasoning mind, the logical mind, that's just habit. I've got to break that habit. But the shadow side of operating from the logical reasoning mind is that there can be cognitive inflexibility. And what that means is there can be rigidity. If you work from this mind, if you operate from this mind, then that means that you typically tend to come to a conclusion and then stick to that conclusion. We all sort of do this. But when you stick to that conclusion, you're not leaving room for life to happen. You're not leaving room for grace to happen. You're not leaving room for anything other than what happened previously to happen again. And so people who are cognitively inflexible are going to be very much, it's this way and no other way. It's my way or the highway. There's very black and white thinking involved. And that's not helpful either. I mean, we really need some sort of middle ground, some sort of moderation between both minds, because ultimately where the emotional mind and the reasoning mind intersect is referred to as the wise mind. And ultimately the wise mind is where I was, I guess instinctively, hardwired going in both those situations I told you about with my mother and then with my partner. Initially, I would operate from the emotional mind because all of these thoughts and all these conclusions were happening in my mind without me being aware of it. And then it was manifesting as emotion. So thought was leading to emotion. And then that emotion, when I was aware of it and I understood that it was unhelpful to be experiencing something like that was that extreme, then led to thought, reason, logic. I moved into structure. The wise mind. I'm in the presence of both emotion and logic. And from there, I can operate in a productive way. I can respond to a situation instead of emotionally react to a situation. Listen, I'm talking about all this because I think that every single one of us, pretty much by this point in this episode, can identify which of the two minds we naturally default from. Which of the two minds you naturally default from? Do you naturally operate from the emotional mind? Are you more of an emotional thinker? Or are you more of a reasoning thinker, a logical, intellectual thinker? One is not necessarily better than the other because both can provide obstacles on the path towards efficient healing, for lack of a better term. But I think it's really important for us to understand where we've been, who we've been, so that we know who we are today, and more importantly, how to operate from here on in. Where to go, how to be in the future when things go wrong, because the only thing we know about life is that everything is changing. There are ups, there are downs. And when there are downs, typically for us emotional thinkers, there is a very irrational, and I'm using that term specifically now, there is an irrational part of the brain that believes that this discomfort, this fear, this moment is forever. And the body braces as if it is forever. There is like a muscular lockdown, this muscular holding pattern that locks down in the body, tension lands, contraction happens, and we think, my God, this is going to be the rest of my life. I'm going to have to deal with this for the rest of my life. Worst case scenario. And that's where all of a sudden we default to the reasoning mind and think, okay, there's no evidence for that. Where is the evidence that shows you that this is going to be forever? There may be a fear that it's going to be that way, but there's no evidence. And so if there's no evidence, how do I operate from here? Well, let's start to gain evidence. And right there, the wise mind. Which are you? Are you more of the emotional mind or are you more of the reasoning mind? And how has being whichever psychological profile or fitting into whichever psychological profile, how has that served you in the past? And how has it hindered you? Because I can tell you that being emotional has been extremely productive for me and extremely helpful for me because it has helped me relate to other people, especially when those other people are going through difficult moments. And my role on earth in this body is to accompany people through those difficult moments. So me having this emotional awareness and emotional intelligence is extremely, extremely, extremely relevant and important and vital. To me, that's a blessing. However, the shadow side of that is I can easily go into fear. And listen, to be honest, I don't spend that much time in fear anymore. I have in my life. I've done it. I got so sick of it that I just went to the other end of the spectrum. But nonetheless, for me, there's not really fear of death. I don't fear death, bodily death at all. There is some fear associated to suffering, my own. There is more fear associated to the suffering of the people I love. So when I know that someone around me is compromised in any way, shape, or form, that's where fear will land. And by now I know that's where my work is, right? That's where I'm meant to respond and apply all the things that I've learned and do my best to not get stuck in the emotion of it all. But which has been your situation? Which has been your reality? And which has been helpful? And has it also been unhelpful? And have you realized that it can be broken down into this kind of very linear thinking methodology? Have you realized that you can just fall into a psychological profile, identify the opposite psychological profile, and sort of dance between the two? I'd be really curious to hear. Feel free to reach out through whatever mediums you feel like reaching out, email, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, and let me know. Because I'm really fascinated by the collective experience. The individual experience, I believe, is meant to be shared. Obviously, that's why I'm doing this, so that we can tap into the collective experience and understand that this collective experience is collective. You know, we're encouraged to believe that we have nothing to do with each other. Well, you know what I call bullshit. We have everything to do with each other. We are all in this together. We are all operating through this game of life together. There may be some serious differences in terms of, you know, culture and demographics and stuff that will actually be different person to person. But at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, we are all here trying to make our way through this jungle of life. So listen, let me know. Emotional mind, reasoning mind. Let me know what you think. give it a think, and I'll see you later. This has been the Examine Life with Bram Levinson.